At a high level, connectors need to reliably carry power and signal for the environment that they're in. So a couple of the consequences of inappropriate connector selection are potential fire hazards, contaminants entering into the connector, signal integrity issues, and intermittent connections. So when a customer is not exactly sure what type of connector that they need for a particular application, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, first of all, is it going to be a signal or power connector? And if it is a signal connector, what kind of signals need to be carried? Is it going to be extremely high-speed transfer? Is it going to require a large number of circuits to carry those signals? If the cable is going to carry power, we need to know how many amps are going to go through each circuit. We need to know what kind of environment the cable assembly is going to be exposed to, whether a cable is going to be installed inside an enclosure where it could need a panel mount or board mounted connector, or if it's going to be installed outside an enclosure where it could be subject to sunlight, liquid exposure, or other contaminants. So after we've evaluated some of the basic characteristics that the connector needs to have, then we start looking a little closer at some of our own tooling capabilities. Because if we can avoid tooling charges, it'll really make a much more economical assembly. Multi-Tek has tooling for a wide variety of connector systems that are useful in almost every application. So if we're able to work with OEMs and engineers early on in the design process, we can save $4,000 to $8,000 in tooling costs. Okay, what are the reasons why somebody would need a completely custom connector? You can't find it off the shelf. Nobody makes this connector. You need to have an engineer completely fabricate something from CAD to perform in some particular application. These things do happen. Sometimes there's just nothing that is available off the shelf that fits the bill. This is something that requires 16 to 24 weeks lead time to prepare and is extremely costly in terms of tooling charges. It's also not a service that most cable assembly manufacturers provide. When we do get requests for these types of connectors, I like to show people the Harting Han modular system. There are dozens of different connector inserts for almost any application, including power, data, coax, and fiber optic, and they're installed inside a modular connector system that can be configured to whatever your specific needs are. Choosing a system like this instead of designing a completely custom connector has several benefits because there's potentially tens of thousands of dollars in tooling and development costs, long lead times and high minimum order quantities, and then also from a manufacturability standpoint, you're dealing with a connector system that nobody has ever seen before. So there aren't standardized processes for installation and termination of those types of connectors. There are a number of benefits for choosing standardized connector types when designing your system. Some of those are M12s and M8s, commonly used in the motion control and factory automation settings, RJ45 connectors, C13 and C14 power connectors, and USB. So these types of cable assemblies are commonly referred to as commodity type cables. They're produced in high volume, they're standardized designs, and they're extremely economical. If you need a complete overmolded cable assembly, choosing a commercial off-the-shelf cable is usually the most economic way of doing this because it's going to avoid several $1,000s in molding tooling costs. Another point that I wanted to touch on is that whenever possible, it's a good idea to work with the electrical engineer in your organization so that when they're designing the board, they're picking a connector with the largest pitch that's possible for the application. Something like a 2.54 millimeter pitch, which is a 0.100 center line. This is great from an assembly standpoint. If you have the room in your application, pick the biggest connector that you can. It will lower the cost of assembly by making the cable more manufacturable. A lot of cable assembly manufacturers, when you send them a quote, that has a name brand connector on it, we'll substitute that for a knockoff connector, usually sourced through Alibaba or other similar channels. Multi-Tek chooses to use name brand connectors only because although these parts are often advertised as form, fit, and function compatible, more often than not, they're complete garbage. Occasionally we're sent samples to reverse engineer for a quote, and we can always immediately recognize these knockoff connectors. Oftentimes the terminals don't seat properly in the housings, and the connectors themselves don't mate properly to the board as they're designed to. Another problem with choosing these generic connectors is they're going to make UL certification really difficult, if not impossible, because when we provide UL documentation to our customers, we have to show that every single part in the bill of materials is a UL recognized component, and none of these parts are. There's often times where a connector system looks great on paper. It ticks all of the boxes for everything that your system needs, and then when it comes time to assembly, we find it's not everything that it cracked up to be, and there ends up being longer assembly times than were expected, difficult construction methods. Sometimes choosing a connector with a little bit higher BOM cost actually results in a net savings because it's so much easier to assemble.